Welcome for this our session of Islamic Architecture and Legacy course. I welcome all of you here. And just I humble request to all the participants, those who are sending their daily assignments. Today we will share one link with you, Google Drive link with you. Please put your all the homeworks in that link. After completing the session,
Sir, you're not audible. Actually, sir is having some network issues. Just give us some time. We will rectify this problem.
Hello, Nasreen ma'am. If meantime I can ask you a few questions, because then we will start doing our assignments and all.
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, I just want to know, is there any word limit for the thing? For the assignments, is there any word limit?
Word limit, no.
No.
There is no word limit. You can give your assignments, preferably with hand sketches, graphical representations.
Okay, ma'am. And you want the assignment in typeset, or you want it to be handwritten? Like,
it is your convenient. You can type, or you can even give handwritten, because we are getting both formats. Assignments, we are getting in both formats.
Thank you. I think sir is back.
Yes, yes.
Ma'am, and we have already submitted to you, so we have to resubmit again.
Please.
Yeah, I'll give you all these details after we complete this session. Okay. Shall I start?
Okay, ma'am.
Yes, please, please. Please start.
Okay, okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back for Day 5, Islamic Architectural Legacy in the Lands of Islam. So today we will look into the Timurid city tomb architecture. So for today's session, I have some objectives. Like here, Timur created his capital in Samarkand. So first we will consider the tents and palace of Timur and the ways in which the interaction of nomadic and sedentary model may have affected the form and decoration of permanent architecture made of ceramic and brick in the city of Samarkand. We will look. And we will also look at a burial complex developed by the wives and daughters of Timur, which was associated with a cousin of Prophet Muhammad, who had come to Central Asia in the 7th century, and he met his martyrdom there. So we will look into this burial complex. And a major theme that we will explore in this session concerns a dialogue between soft and hard architecture. Soft and hard architecture means between an architecture that is portable, ephemeral, and essentially nomadic in nature, and its interaction with sedentary forms of architecture that were mostly permanent and fixed. And we'll also understand its impact of temporary and permanent architecture, and how do ceramic tiles reflect the impact of portable architecture. So we will try to get some answers for these with respect to some case studies here. So in Timurid Samarkand, we will also explore how Timur and the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, who were already deeply familiar with the traditions of sedentary Islam accumulated and redirected diverse cultural and aesthetic traditions. Here we will look into some useful terms. Ziyarat Khana means it's a room of visitation. Rauda means it's a garden with tomb. Sarparda means it's a palace curtain tented with, it's a wall demarcating the boundaries and forming enclosures. Urdu, we also already saw this in the last class. It's a camp, or it's a palace tent, or a headquarters, or it could be a seat of power or a royal court. So next is Kurilthe. It's an assembly of Mongolian or Turkic tribes, sometimes called a council, and usually meeting for the purpose of making political decisions. And we will come across this important term, that's mosaic faience. It's a technique in which pieces of differently glazed ceramics are built in a jigsaw-like assemblage. Each piece of differently colored ceramic is set into a plaster bed and placed against the wall and attached to it. So we will look into a lot of examples of this mosaic faience. Timur was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who founded Timurid Empire in and around modern-day Afghanistan, Iran, Central Asia, and he became the first ruler of Timurid dynasty. So Timur, he was born in Transoxiana, which is the another name of Central Asia, which is near the city of Samarkand, around 1330. So he belonged to a tribe known as Barlas. So many of the Turkic tribes had come to the region with Genghis Khan's campaigns of the early 1200s. So here you can see the picture painting predicting the Genghis Khan's campaign of early 1200s. So like many of other Mongol tribes in the region, these Barlas remained a nomadic tribe but had close relations with the sedentary communities nearby. So they had also come to adopt Islam in earlier periods and to participate in sedentary culture. Sedentary culture means it is with respect to Sufism. In his youth, Timur practiced animal husbandry and moving his herd toward the Kashka Darya river valley and the Zarafshan mountain region. Here you can see the location of this Barlas Turco-Mongol tribe territory. So this is the location of Samarkand, and here is Shahre Shabz-Kish. So in between this is this Kashka Darya river valley and the Zarafshan mountain region. So here you can see this is the area of this Kashka Darya river, which is sitting between the cities of Samarkand and Shahre Sabz. In modern day, it's called as Uzbekistan. So here we'll understand the Timur's rising power. In his early years, Timur cultivated his personal charisma, military guile, and skills in warfare and attracted a band of loyal followers. His supporters grew in number at the point that Timur was capable of overthrowing the most powerful figures of his day. So after securing his uncontested position, he embarked on a series of campaigns that spanned the remaining years of his life until his death in 1405. So after some 20 years, he spent his time on active campaign in different parts of the Islamic world. So as Timur undertook these campaigns, riches followed into his hands, and he distributed a portion of them to his military commanders and other members of the Timurid elite. So after capturing each territory, he installed governors who would be responsible for ensuring taxation on the settled populations. So in addition to the material wealth of these regions, he also collected talented artisans and craftsmen and brought them back to his capital, Samarkand. This enabled Samarkand to become a great center of intellectual talent, as well as the arts, crafts, and architecture. All of these figures were relocated to Samarkand and put to work for Timur. So here you can see the extent of Timurid dynasty, so which included Bukhara, Tabriz, Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Kabul, also Baghdad. All these regions came under Timurid's dynasty. So coming to Timurid's art, Timurids continued to hold great prestige in their cultural production. Works of art and architecture sponsored by Timurid patrons continued to establish a benchmark of excellence in their respective artistic field. Both contemporary and later dynasties, including Ottomans, Turkmens, then Safavids, and also Mughals, look to Timurid achievements in art and architecture. Timurid's arts offered a compelling model for cultural assimilation. The idea that architecture could embody a particular ideology was already demonstrated at the beginning of Timur's rule. So here we can see one example of Timur's big monument. It's a palace. This monument is a Aksare. It's called as Aksare, or White Palace. It was begun in 1379 in Shahre-Sabz after Timur's campaign in Khwarezm. So the monumental portal led into the courtyard that was surrounded by arcades that gave to gardens with pavilions. So right now only the portal is remaining. Actually, it's totally deteriorated. Through the extent portal, the only remains of this Aksare, what we see here, we get a sense of the monumentality of this palace complex. The monumental portal has engaged towers columns. So these towers columns you can see on the other side also. Okay, on each side that resembles like something like minarets. So a high pointed arc at the center of the portal, which no longer exists, was covered in a stunning variety of ceramics in various techniques. So in addition to the geometric and naturalistic floral patterns that are seen in the palette of blues, ochres, greens, and browns, there are also inscriptions in diverse script types covering the building. So this includes geometric Kufic script as well as a more rounded form of Kufic scripts. So this is called like 6 cursive scripts. So we can see these kind of scripts in this building. So the inscriptions make a set of statements. One is the Sultan is God's shadow on earth. This constructs a literal connection between the role of the Sultan as God's representative on earth through the physical shadow that the immense portal casts. So the portal becomes a symbol of Timur. So one more inscription which reads, "If you have doubts about our grandeur, look at our edifice." So this makes a clear political statement by equating the monumentality of the building with the ruler's power. And one more statement, the Sultan binds his enemies with the chains of his good deeds. So this supports the concept of the moral Sultan being an exemplar but also enforcer. When he captures and imprisons his enemies, it is because their bad deeds. So something like that, the meanings can be understood with the inscriptions. So here we will understand Timurid soft architecture times. So the major theme of Timurid architecture is dialogue between soft and hard forms, between an architecture that is portable and essentially nomadic in nature, and its intersection with the sedentary forms of architecture that are typically fixed in nature. So this is a painting from Zafarnama. Zafarnama means it's a book of conquests by author Yazdi. So this shows Timur enthroned in the outdoor tented ensemble here. And the traditional shape of yurt is evident over here. So the round tent made up of trellised sections are connected together and surmounted by curved poles. So these poles come together at the top and are inserted into a circle resembling a spoked wheel here. The wooden frame can be taken apart and reassembled. So the yurt were covered with various types of textiles, the most traditional being white felt. So Timur's tent, however, is depicted here is a very ornate brocaded kind of textile. So in the background over here, there is a wall made up of white cloth trimmed in blue that encloses awnings and other tents where you can see women occupying this space here inside. So this tented wall is called as Saraparada in Persian. It's a Persian word. So while tents were portable and temporary, they were often organized in a manner as formal as sedentary town architecture and were assembled following conventions of urban planning. So cloth walls were used to mark the boundaries in the space, and these distinctions reflected social hierarchy, marked gendered space, and also controlled access through points of passage. So these were therefore complexly organized spaces. Here you can see that this tent city is appearing to stimulate fixed architectural forms. So Samarkand as a symbol of empire. So around the city, there were also a series of gardens that Timur commissioned. These were enclosed spaces that were recreational, but also productive as orchards and markets. So here of the city, it had many gates, and also all these dotted portions, what you see here, these are the cemeteries. And one cemetery which is outside Samarkand, you can see that is Shah-e-Zinda. So we will look into this tomb architecture in detail. Timur also constructed many pavilions in these gardens, which looked like palaces. So between the extramural gardens, there were many small villages, which were named after the cities of world which Timur had conquered. The city of Samarkand and its environs could be seen as a symbolic microcosm of Timur's empire. So as Timur traveled between the gardens, he could be seen as performing a reenactment of his military campaigns and victories across the lands of Islam. So here we will take an example, like a case study for Bure Emir highlights. So Bure Emir, this is built by Timur and celebrated. It's a celebrated monument as the resting place for his grandson and a higher apparent, that is Muhammad Sultan, who died in a battle in 1403. When Muhammad Sultan died, his body was brought back to Samarkand, and he was given a burial over here. So Timur decided to create a dynastic mausoleum. Here you can see this is the dynastic mausoleum. He added, actually, there was already two structures over here. This is Khanka and the Madrasa. This was already built by Muhammad Sultan. He already had sponsored this earlier, these two structures. So in the same place, Timur decided to construct a dynastic mausoleum. So this is a courtyard, what you can see here, to the south of that courtyard, there was a dynastic mausoleum. And also you can see a portal over here and Ivan, and which is axially, almost axially located, the tombs. This is a complex structure. It started between 1400 and 1402 through the patronage of, actually, as I told, his grandson, Muhammad Sultan, who already died. Before the addition of the tomb, it was as I told, it's already having Khanqa means it's like usually the Sufi saints, they used to be sponsored by the kings. Like the Sufi saints means they just abandon the outer, they abandon the life, public life, they just abandon, and they just dedicate their life for prayers, and they 24/7 they are only praying, they are not working, they are not doing anything else. So kings usually they are giving the provision for them, like Khanqa. So they will be lodged here, they will be given space for praying, and continuously they keep on reciting the Quran and also doing prayers. So in madrasa also they used to just teach Quranic educations, and also they used to recite Quran over there. So that is why this king, he decided to add the tomb over here, dynastic mausoleum, because when there is a continuous recitation, it's like these people are giving blessings to the deceased. So that is the reason why these kind of multi-purpose buildings with different activities came together here. So here you can see the courtyard, the madrasa, dynastic mausoleum. This side was the Khanqa, and this is the portal. And then you can even see one more Ivan over here. The other side was the madrasa. So here we will understand Gur Emir's technology of mosaic finance. So much of the original tile work survives on the portal. It is executed in the technique known as the mosaic finance, so which can be best understood as a jigsaw. Jigsaw means like a puzzle. They are arranging it like a puzzle. In mosaic finance, each piece of differently glazed ceramic is arranged to form a jigsaw-like assemblage, with each piece set into a plaster bed and placed on the wall and attached. Overall, it produces an effect which combines cool blues with some warm colors. In addition to the naturalistic floral motifs, the effect of naturalism is enhanced by the different spectrum of individual colors, like example green and their hues. Mosaic fiancé is made by a tile cutter who sat before a palette of glazed tiles and cut. He used to cut out the desirable shape from those tiles. The cut pieces were then assembled into the pattern resembling a jigsaw puzzle. So in naturalism, produced through the variation of color was further enhanced by slight variations in the repeated patterns and motifs. So here we can understand the inscriptions. Mosaic fiancé developed in the cities of Shiraz, Kirman, and also in Yazd under a dynasty called Muzaffarids. Okay, that succeeded the Ilkhanids. So the mosaic fiancé found on the facade of this Gur Emir is an evidence of the relocation of artists from Timur's conquered territories to his capital here. So the inscription at the top confirms the statement, the work of the weak servant Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Isfahani. This signature is of an artist from Isfahan who has been transplanted to Samarkand where he contributed a regional style into the emerging multi-regional repertoire of Timurid architecture. So here we can understand the dome. The appearance and construction features of the dome reveals the arrival of craftsmen from southern and central Iran. Here you can see the inner dome is set at a height suitably scaled to the visitor, while greater height here, greater height of the exterior dome increases the building's visibility within the city. If there were only the tall outer dome, if only this dome was there, it would be too distant to be seen from the interior perspective. The double dome allowed visitors to experience a harmonious balance of scale and proportion inside the building. So this innovation enhanced the spatial experience of both the exterior and also interior spaces. So the exterior ribbed dome is set over an extended drum and strengthened by a series of flanges that are arranged radially around the dome. A pillar rises from the top here. You can see from the top of the inner dome with a series of wooden poles extending from it to the inner surface of the exterior dome. So these solutions solved both structurally and aesthetical challenges. The exterior dome of the here is decorated with polychrome ceramics, some of which are arranged in geometric Kufic script that comprises the names of God and Muhammad. The inscription running around the base of the drum reads, "Eternity belongs to God." So here we can understand the interior of Gure Emir. Here there is an extraordinary program of decoration inside the building with a dado of carved onyx surmounted in an epigraphic frieze. This is the frieze. The frieze is carved from jasper, decorated with red and gold paint. So you can also see Mukarna walls. They were incorporated into recessed base of the four corners of the interiors. In the upper section of the walls was decorated in painted gold plaster and molded paper surfaces, similar to a modified paper mache. So molded paper was applied to the walls and painted in gold and blue. This mode of paper and plaster decoration continues up to the upper section of the dome, where the motifs shift into a floral form that includes an arabesque of palmetes. Palmetes means ornaments of radiating petals like palms. The palmetes are attached to the interior surface of the dome and get smaller in size as they approach the apex of the dome. So this creates an optical illusion of dramatic foreshortening. So coming to the tomb of Timur, the black nephrite, here you can see the black nephrite cenotape was added in 1420s by Timur's grandson Ulugh Bey. The stone came from Inner Asia and has a long genealogical inscriptions. So this text makes bold claims of Timur's ancestry, invoking prestigious lines of descent through both Mongols and Islamic cultures. So now we will come to the site of Shah-e-Zinda, which is a shrine center. This site developed as a street lined with tombs outside the walls of Samarkand over 1300 and 1400. But this site was also previously, before Timur's, it was existing. So there was this is a site called Shah-e-Zinda. It is the other word of this is the living king. So which was a shrine center that had developed in as I told pre-Timurid times. It was patronized in the Timurid period by elite women such as the wives and sisters of Timur, as well as the military commanders. So the Shahi Zinda is a funerary complex located on the southern side of the Afrasiyad hill to the north of Samarkand. Here you can see this is the location of Shahi Zinda. This is Samarkand, and this is that Afrasiyad hill at the north of this Samarkand. So in addition to this Shahi Zinda, several infrastructural roads and were also came up here, designed to support commerce and also administration of Timurid's dynasty. Timurid elites also cultivated a series of sites in and around the city that held a religious importance. These were not simply for the function of formal worship, but also shrines. So here you can see there are so many shrines located within the Samarkand. This is the street of Shahi Zinda. Here, other important shrines, what I am telling you, have already created. They are like example, tomb of Ruhabad, which was built on by the order of Timur for the mystic Sheikh Burhan al-Din Sagarji. And one more is Chupanata, Lord of Shepherds, was a shrine dedicated to the patron saint of shepherds, which was also associated with Prophet Daniel. Okay, so one site dedicated to elite Timurid women in the 15th century. This is the Shahi Zinda. The site developed as a street lined with several tombs outside the walls of in 1300s it came up. The earliest components have been highlighted in it's been hatched in dark gray color. You can see those were the shrines which came up before Timurids. So here Shahi Zinda is built on the site where Qutham ibn Abbas is believed to have jumped into a well. So Qutham ibn Abbas was a cousin of Prophet Muhammad, who had come to Central Asia in 676 to spread the words of Islam and also to give the teachings of Islam. So he had come in this place. That is why the story of the Living King, the name of that street they say Living King. So the story goes on that he was preparing himself for prayer, making his ablutions, at which point he was attacked by infidels. Infidels means maybe Zoroastrians or maybe Turks. They attacked him and cut off his head. So even with his head removed, he was able to pick it up and jump into a well. Hence the title of the site came as Living King. So it's believed that he continued to live in this well over a passage of time. So Qutham B. Abbas is the founding figure of the site, and the buildings which grew up around it benefited from this holy presence. A madrasa was built in mid 12th century opposite the site of Gurkhana, that is the tomb chamber of Qutham Abbas, and Ziyarat Khana, that is the room of visitation of the saint. So this created a social hub. It became like a social hub and was surrounded by a lot of commercial and also residential districts. So in the late 14th century, the site was appropriated by the Timurids by continuing to develop and add to the site. The Timurids encouraged associations between themselves and the family of the Prophet Muhammad here. So a series of terraces and steps were constructed to bring visitors from the lower terrain of the city of Samarkand up the hill to the shrine center on the hilltop of the farmer Afrasiya tree. with the most privileged locations being located on the street interconnecting the lower terraces and the shrine center. So this particular site is recognized by UNESCO World Heritage Site, and most richest tile work you can see in this Islamic structure. So I'm going to discuss some of the tombs here, some of the mausoleums. Some examples are like the mausoleum of Khwaja Ahmad, which was built in 1350 and signed by artist Fakhr Ali. Next is the mausoleum of Kutlak Aka, which was built in 1361. Mausoleum of Shade Mulk Aka, patronized by Turkan Aka, that is the elder sister of Timur, for her daughter Shadi Mulk. Then mausoleum of Shirin Bika Aka, this was in 1385 and 86, built by a sister of Timur, including texts from Socrates and Sadi. So Tuman Aka complex, the fifth one. The complex includes a mausoleum and also a mosque. This complex was built by wife of Timur and daughter of General Amir Musa. So in this portion of session, we will focus on these sites and specifically their use on ornate ceramic tile work and complex inscription programs, and we'll try to understand the inscription details and architectural decorations will be discussed here. So the very earliest tomb to be discussed in this session is that of Khwaja Ahmad. The tomb of Khwaja Ahmad, which was built in 1350, established a pattern of single chamber tombs that would be built at the site. So this represents a kind of indigenous style of architecture before the forms introduced by the Timurids. It is composed of a square chamber with an octagonal crypt below. Only the front side of the tomb is covered in ornate tile work arranged in bands that frame the portal. There is also a very simple barrel board set above the doorway, forming a recessed arch on the portal. Originally, it consisted of a dome covered interior space with an octagonal transitional zone with squinches below. So there were two types of ornaments here in this building that appeared deeply carved terracotta and an underglaze painted star tile with a block design under the light of blue glaze. Here the surface of the ceramic is in relief with the inscriptions higher than the ground behind them. So these carved pieces of terracotta are glazed with different colors in the process of firing. Here inscriptions play a key role in the program. One reads, "May God lend in their life that this be a tomb of life, the garden of fortune of Khwaja Ahmad, who had no equal in beauty." The idea of the tomb as a garden is expressed here and as a common trope of tomb architecture. The inscription also contains the names of artisans responsible for the tile execution. So usually Fakhr Ali, he was the artisan. So his details also we can find in the inscriptions. In addition to the foundation text, there is also a memento mori, which serves as a warning or reminder of death. The inscriptions include a dual use of languages with texts written in Arabic and also in Persian. A Persian inscription reads, "If you were a Shah of Iraq or the King of China, your end would be still under the ground. Why do you attach your heart to this passing world if the consequence of every deed be such?" So this points to another major theme in this inscription of the building, which is the constant reminder in life about death and the afterlife. One is reminded not to attach too much of the ego to aspects of success in this world, or to the accumulation of wealth here. So this is the ornate tile work arranged in the bands that frame the portal. And here, this is the deeply carved terracotta and the underglazed painted star tile with block designs under the light blue glaze. This is the location of this particular mausoleum. Next, coming to tomb of Shah-e-Mulk Aga. This was constructed in 7183. Here the entire exterior is covered in ceramic treatments, as well as, even if you see interior, the whole of interior is covered by this kind of decorations. Interior is enhanced by a dome sheathed in various colors and also techniques. This tomb shows the transition of complete coverage of the space. So this was the location of the tomb of Shah-e-Mulk Aga. So here the inscriptions of tomb of Shah-e-Mulk Aga near the framing portal, it is in Arabic, and it reads, "This building is like a smiling Horus and silken veils that are like a white floor in the attractiveness of their appearance and beauty." So here we can notice that here the architecture is feminized through the inscriptions, discussion of beauty, which is likened to the effect of white floor, suggesting makeup. And here Horus means they are the inhabitants of paradise, intended to provide those who enter paradise with pleasure. Also, there is one more inscription erected by Kutluk Turkan Aga for the crystal of the monarch, the delight of her excellency, the treasury of her heart, something like that. She was taken to the tomb base in the month of December 1371. This is also one of the inscriptions. So the inscription develops the iconography of the tomb and defines a set of relationship between the things in the world and also the tomb itself. Next, in the tomb of this Shah-e-Mulk Aga, the inscriptions framing near the door, this is a garden in which lies buried a treasury of good fortune. This is a tomb in which a precious pearl has been lost. In it, the one of Cyprus stature finds grace. One may take solace in that we both may be underground. Consider that Solomon was carried away by a gust, despite the fact that the seal of protection was in his ring. So these metaphors draw parallels between the individual buried in the tomb and the architecture which contains them. So the deceased can be considered as a pearl, while the oyster can be understood as a tomb. An illusion is made to King Solomon, who was protected by a ring, but was still mortal. So all of the names of the builders and craftsmen also are listed here in the inscriptions of the building, and none of the inscriptions over here are Quranic. Therefore, there is a language of PT developed in these tombs without making references to Quranic verses. Next, coming to tomb of Shirin Bika Aga. So, in addition to sayings of Socrates, there is an inscription of poetry on the ark, on this ark, taken from the Gulistan, that is Rose Garden, which was written by Sadi. So, this text is a collection of anecdotes and admonishments on how to conduct the best kind of ethical and moral life, arranged into 8 chapters. So one of the texts quoted here reads, "The world, my brother, will abide with none. By the world's maker, let thy heart be one." So the architect selected this text specifically for this location over here in the main ark, when Sadi made this statement in his text, he added that it was inscribed in the archway of Faridun. So Faridun means a pre-Islamic king of Iran. It has also been placed on an archway of the tomb of Shirin Bika Aga. So the same position he has tried to inscribe it on the main arc over here, where the Faridun king's inscription was there. Even here, they took the same concept over here. So coming to Tumanaka complex, it was built at the top of the street. So here you can see the location. The tomb of Tumanaka is completely covered in mosaic fiancé, and the complex was built by the wife of Timur for a relative, maybe daughter or maybe some religious leader. She commissioned the tomb in 1404 and 1405. It is a very tall, elegant mausoleum with an arch set inside the framing portal at the front above the doorway to the tomb. The whole structure is surmounted by the dome set behind it here. Here you can see there is a mosque also connected to that. That is Tumanaka complex. There is a mosque behind that. So you can see that location, which was built adjacent to the mausoleum. The mosque was joined to the tomb with a small window set inside that enabled those who gathered to worship in the mosque to also have visual access to the interior of the tomb through a panjara. Panjara means window. So here, Tumanaka complex, it had an extensive program of inscriptions. One over the portal of mausoleum describes the space as an illuminated shrine. Here, the theme of light is also prominent in the inscriptions, with spiritual blessings manifested through light. The inscription also refers to the foundation of tomb and the year of its construction. The theme of light continues in the pylons that frame the portal, which read, in the name of God, the merciful, magnificent Lord, give us light in our heart, light in our graves, light in our candle, light in our vision. So the glaze of the ceramics bounces light off the facade, recalling this idea of the effects and properties of light. So in the arc of the doorway of the tomb, the inscription states, the noblest of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, said, the tomb is a door and everyone enters it. So once again, here we can see that one is reminded of one's mortality. So next one is the Sheikh Muhammad, there is a signature identified the designer of the inscription as Sheikh Muhammad Haji Bandgir Al-Tugrai Tabrizi. So as indicated by his name, this calligrapher came from Tabriz and is known as Tugrai because one of his jobs was to prepare official documents in the chancellery. It has been determined that this calligrapher came from the great family of calligraphers. So this shows that a calligrapher would have designed inscriptions on a paper, and it would then have been converted into mosaic fiancé for the facade of the monuments. So another important feature of the designs executed in mosaic fiancé was its convertibility. So these inscriptions were executed in artistic workshops by artists, also painters, calligraphers, that were then translated into medium of mosaic fiancé to be viewed on the building. So with designs coming from centralized artistic institution, this was a very different operation than the work of independent ceramic workshops. So here in the Tumanaka complex mosque inscription over the doorway of the mosque reads, "Hasten to prayer before death, hasten to repentance before death." These are sayings attributed to Prophet Muhammad, and of course, the statements urging the visitors towards the prayer and also repentance before death. So there is also an inscription attributed to Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law Ali, stating, "There is no strength except in obedience to God the Exalted." So the program is developed through additions of these inscriptions here. So as the site developed under the Timurids, one interesting aspect of Shah-e-Zinda is the exploitation of burial site of Qutb ibn Abbas to bolster the Timurids' claim as leaders of religion, Islam, its principles and its foundations. So Shah-e-Zinda develops as a gendered space of pilgrimage, and most of the monuments are associated with elite women. So it is a site open to female piety and also worships. While Shah-e-Zinda is not exclusively feminized, the architecture which develops here predominantly reflects female patronage. In addition to this major feature of the shrine, it is a great manifestation of the interplay between soft and hard architecture. So today's session is a little short session. Almost we have completed today's session, and these are the list of topics which we have already finished. And in tomorrow's session, we will be looking into Alhambra Granada, a cross-cultural aesthetic in Spain. And today's assignment would be how do ceramic tiles reflect the impact of portable architecture? So now I'll just hand over the mic to Dr. Bijan.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot. Here, there are few questions in our chat box. When by Nayan Taraji, the inscription on Khwaja Ahmed Tom sounds very Sufi type to me, where they influenced by Sufism. Khwaja Ahmed Tom.
Yes, they were influenced by the Sufism, because the sedentary lifestyle of Islam, what we are talking here, that is mainly Sufism. So Sufism means they are usually not doing any work. They are like in one place and they are always towards recitation of Quran, and then they are praying all the time. So they are away from the public life. So usually they are sponsored by these kings or the sultans. They are sponsored. I mean, they don't do any work. No? So for the income and all, for staying purpose and all, sultans used to sponsor them. So in that region, it was like more Sufism was there. So because of that only, these they were the descendants of Mongols, right? The Timurids. So they were attracted with this kind of Sufism. That's why they embraced the Islam. How are Timurids related to India? Timurids, his great-grandson was Babur. So that's how it's been related to India. How many buildings are there in the street of Shah-e-Zinda? Shah-e-Zinda, we can say around 20 monuments are there. That street is around 200 meters stretch, and it is under the UNESCO heritage, one of the UNESCO heritage site. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Is there any special study materials of these special dynasties? Like that in India, we can see the architecture of this Rashtrakutas, or like that the architecture of Satavahanas. So like that, is there any particular books regarding these each dynasties?
Regarding the books, I'll just let you know.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I heard about the question. Actually, exactly. don't know the books names, but if there is any information, I'll let you know about it. And here I can say that
Yes. Okay.
in Humayun tombs and also in Agra, right? Agra Taj Mahal. So those tombs and all, they were influenced by the Gure Emir, the tomb of Timur. So a lot of architectural characteristics were influenced by Timur's architecture, even in India.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. At last,
Sir,
Manisha Madam.
In India, Rizvi is a wonderful book along the history of Arabs to see the connect well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for the information. Okay. The Eternal Garden by Carl Ernst is another one. Yeah. She's giving some references. Thank you, ma'am, for this.
Yes, thank you. And once again, at last, I request to all the participants, please put your daily assignments in the Google Drive link, which will be share today just after finish this our session. There you can put the daily assignments in the box like that, day 1, day 2, like that, so that we can share the same thing in the university record, because you will get the certificate of the university, so it's necessary for all. So thanks a lot to all again, and with the kind permission of all of you, now today here 4-5 minutes before we will stop, and tomorrow we'll meet again. So thank you. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you everyone. Thanks for attending.
Sir, if you allow me, can I make a request, please?
Yes, please.
Ma'am,
yes, please.
I understand the expanse of the lecture we're doing, or the course we're covering up. I wanted to, however, request if you could also cover how the expansion of the Kaaba has been doing, because for me, that's the city that never sleeps, because you have pilgrims flowing in and out from different zones of in the world. So if you could explain how, maybe towards the end, that how do they not disturb the circulation of the people who come for Umrah or even Hajj, and they're still expanding. So if that you could cover up in one of the sessions towards the end, I'd really appreciate it.
Actually, your voice is low, very low. I could not understand the question properly. Can you put it in the chat box?
Okay, is my voice better? Is it louder?
Yes, please. Can you little louder tell this?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, ma'am. I was saying that I do understand the expanse of the course that we're doing, but I still wanted to request something of you, that in Umrah or for Hajj also, they're expanding because of the capacity or the inflow that they have. Like I said, to me, that's the city that never sleeps, because we always have people from different time zones all around the world that come. So how do they expand while not disturbing the circulation of the people that come and go? So if you could cover that up a little, maybe towards the